Hello and welcome to my channel Joanne Seal, where I show you how to make and create beautiful things. And today we will be using gouache, which is opaque watercolor, to make a cartoon version of ourselves or somebody else. So firstly, take your image and make it as full screen as possible on your computer monitor. Then take some printer paper and tape it to the monitor. If you turn the lights off, you can see the image more clearly and trace it with a pencil. Once you have your traced image, you can take the masking tape off and then use some charcoal and scribble over the back of the paper, over the lines that you've drawn in pencil. You can use pen to go over these lines so you can see them a bit better, but if you go over the lines in charcoal, you'll have enough graphite to then transfer onto some watercolor paper, which is what I'm doing now. So just take some watercolor paper, turn the page over, and then go over the lines again. I'm using a stylus. You can use a pencil or anything with a sharp end. So everywhere where there is charcoal, you'll just be going over it. So you've got a nice transfer of the image onto watercolor paper. I'm just going over that with pencil now. And then I'm using a fine liner. You can use any fine liner. And then just going over the lines again, just to make them darker so I can see them. And so I can make sure I stay within the lines when I paint. So take your time and make sure it's semi-accurate. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate because we can use the paint. Now I'm using gouache. I'm using two brands of gouache. You can use any gouache that you like in skin tones. And I'm mixing up to a nice skin tone. As you can see, I used an image of Rihanna, so I mixed her skin tones as well as I could. And yeah, I'm just painting this on. This is very sped up. Take your time. Don't go over the lines, and make sure you don't leave too many white bits. You'll see little white patches. A few are okay, but don't leave lots of white patches. Make sure it's all covered up. Now I've put the image of Rihanna into Photoshop and increased the threshold of the hues. And now I'm just seeing where it's all red, and I'm using a pencil and using the image as a guide to add the shading, and it's everything in red that I'm just marking on now. And now I'm going to mix up some paint and make it slightly darker by adding a little tiny bit of black for my shading. Don't make the contrast between the two colors too high, otherwise it will be a little bit too much. Just make it slightly darker, and then where you've drawn on the contours, where the shading is, using your image that I put into Photoshop and then increase the threshold. I'm then now painting that in the darker color, using a fine brush for the more intricate areas and then a larger brush for the wider areas, and keeping well within the lines until it's all finished. And now I'm taking the image again and seeing where it's white, because these will be the highlights, and I'm just drawing those in now. I did some off camera, but I'm drawing those in now with a pencil. It's quite a hard pencil, so the lines are quite faint. And now I'm going to make a slightly lighter version of her skin tone, just by adding a little bit of white to the base color. It shouldn't be too light, because gouache will dry lighter than it looks. So if you make it too light, it's going to dry even lighter, and it might look too bright. So we will be adding some white highlights to the center of these highlights, so it should look okay. So make sure that your shapes are nicely rounded and that the edges are smooth and curved. So it's nice, like a nice rounded shape. I'm just going over all of the highlights. Just tidying them up again a bit with a finer brush. So there you have it. Leave that to dry now. And now I'm doing the hair, and this is just black gouache. And I'm making sure it's an even coverage and making sure that the edges are quite neat. You can use a finer brush to do your edges, and making sure it's the same sort of thickness throughout the image. And now I'm using the same black and a finer paintbrush to put in the eyebrows, and being very careful to stay within the lines as well. So take your time and enjoy the process. It's a really nice, relaxing way to paint. It shouldn't be sort of too stressful or taxing. Now I'm just using green, quite a bright green, which I will tone down. And now I'm adding some lighter highlights just to the center of each of the highlights, just to make it a little bit more three-dimensional. And now adding in some pinkish red for her lips, using a fine brush. And there's a space in the middle where she was smiling, and so you can see her teeth. And now I'm just adding a bit more black for the hair that's sort of behind her head, behind her neck. And I'm leaving a faint white line just to show that it's behind. Now I'm adding some shading into her eyes, because eyes have shading within them, which shows that they're round and shows that the eyelids sort of protrude in front of them. And now I'm darkening the outside of her eyes, her pupils, or irises in fact, and adding in her pupils. This is just a base color, it will eventually be black. So now I'm adding some shading to her lips, just using a slightly darker version of her lip color just to go around the edges and just show some roundness. It just, when you darken the edges, it gives it a bit of a curved look. So also trying to go over some of the white. There were some white patches there. And now I'm putting in her nostrils with a little dab of black, and now using the same black to go around her irises to give them that iris look which they need. And I've made a slightly darker green color for her inner irises, just to add some depth to her eyes. I'm using a slightly lighter pink to add highlights to her lips. And now I'm putting her pupils in, so just making sure they're center and they're low enough. If they're too high, she can look like she's looking up, but if they're lower, it will look like she's looking more directly at the viewer, at the camera. And now I think I'm going to go around her eye just to add some eyelashes. And define her eyes a bit more. So you can use any picture, use a picture of yourself if you want. I didn't want to, I don't like having my picture taken, so I wanted to make a picture of Rihanna, so you can use anything, any picture you want. So now, to make it look more cartoony, like a cartoon, I'm using a brush pen, in fact. This has Indian ink in it, India ink, a pigment ink, and I'm going over some of the lines that I drew in initially, just to define them and to give it that cartoon look. And the pen is quite thick. I put some lines in for her teeth. The pen's quite thick, and I think that gives a better look. I practiced with different sizes of pen, and I found the thicker one was better. I'm adding some highlights into her eyes and her lips, and little highlights into the center of her other highlights as well. It makes it look more three-dimensional. So, almost finished. So now I'm going around the highlights just to blend them very slightly. You don't want to blend them very much at all because you don't want it to look like a painting. I'm just sort of taking the harshness out of the edges of the highlights and the shadow. And this will also cover up any pencil marks that might still be there as well. And that was probably the main aim, I think, to take out the pencil marks and smooth the highlights and shadows a bit. And now I'm just going over her hair just to smooth that out a bit. And now I'm filling in some of her skin that has little white spots in it where the gouache didn't quite cover everything. Just tidying things up. And I need to fill in this area now with pen, which I left before. So there you have it. That was one I made before and it looked quite similar. So I hope you've enjoyed making this cartoon version of ourselves or someone else, and I hope you have a go at making one yourself. I would love to see what you've created. I'll add a link to a Facebook group that you can add your pictures to if you wish, or you can just comment with a link on the video. Anyway, I hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye bye.